I've always believed that love shows itself in small, ordinary choices, not grand gestures or dramatic speeches, that things like remembering what someone drinks with breakfast or picking up groceries when you know the pantry is bare. That's how I saw my marriage to Daniel. Ordinary, steady, built on showing up. We weren't perfect, but we were solid, or at least that's what I told myself in the quiet moments when doubt tried to creep in. Daniel had been tense for weeks. Not angry exactly, just distracted. He would sit at the kitchen table, scrolling through his phone, jaw tight, barely touching his coffee. When I asked what was wrong, he'd sigh and say it was his parents, money issues. His father's hours had been cut again, his mother's arthritis getting worse. "They're struggling," he told me one night, rubbing his temples. "I just don't know how to help them right now." I suggested what seemed obvious. "We can bring them groceries," I said. "At least take that worry off their plate." He hesitated just for a second and then nodded. "Yeah," he said, "that would mean a lot." So that Saturday morning, I filled our cart with careful choices, things his mother liked, the brand of rice his father insisted tasted better, fresh fruit, meat, bread. I even added a small bouquet of carnations because I remembered his mom once saying they reminded her of her childhood. As I loaded the bags into my trunk, I felt that quiet satisfaction that comes from doing something kind, supporting my husband, supporting family. The drive to their house took about 40 minutes, long enough for me to replay small moments from the past few weeks. Daniel coming home later than usual, the way he'd step outside to take phone calls, how he'd been quick to reassure me without actually answering my questions. I told myself I was overthinking. Stress does that to people. Love means trusting even when it feels uncomfortable. When I pulled into their driveway, something felt off. It wasn't dramatic, just a faint sense of wrongness, like when you walk into a room and realize someone's been there even though it looks the same. There were two cars parked out front. One was his parents' old sedan, the other was newer, sleek, definitely not theirs. I sat in my car for a moment, hands resting on the steering wheel, telling myself not to be silly. Maybe a neighbor, maybe a friend. I grabbed the grocery bags and walked up to the door. It was unlocked, like it always was. I pushed it open, calling out, "It's me." The voices inside stopped abruptly. That was the first thing that made my chest tighten. Not the silence itself, but the way it fell, heavy, deliberate. Then I heard Daniel's voice, my husband's voice. "She's here," he said, low and urgent. I froze, grocery bags cutting into my fingers. My mother-in-law, Linda, appeared in the hallway with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Oh, sweetheart," she said, stepping forward, "you didn't have to do all this." "I wanted to," I replied automatically, though my gaze drifted past her, into the living room. That's when I saw it. Suitcases. Two large ones standing upright near the couch, a smaller carry-on beside them. They weren't dusty or old. They looked new, packed, ready. My breath caught so hard it felt like my lungs refused to work. "What's going on?" I asked, my voice sounding far away, even to me. Daniel came into view then. He looked startled, like a child caught doing something he knew he shouldn't. His eyes flicked to the bags in my hands, then back to my face. "Hey," he said, "you're early." Early, as if timing was the problem. I set the groceries down slowly, my heart pounding in my ears. "Why are there suitcases here?" I asked. I laughed a little because sometimes laughter feels safer than fear. "Are you guys going on a trip?" No one answered right away. Linda clasped her hands together, glancing at Daniel. His father, Robert, stood near the window, staring outside like he could wish he could disappear into the yard. Daniel finally cleared his throat. "We were just talking," he said. I stared at him, at the man I shared a bed with, the man who kissed my forehead every morning. Talking about what? The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. I felt something shift inside me, a deep, instinctive warning. This wasn't about groceries. This wasn't about money. Whatever this was, it had been happening without me. Linda moved closer, her voice soft. "Sweetheart, let's all sit down." "No," I said, sharper than I intended. "I just want to know why my husband is here with packed suitcases." Daniel ran a hand through his hair. He wouldn't meet my eyes. "It's not what you think." That sentence, it's funny how quickly it can unravel your sense of safety. "Then tell me what it is," I said. He opened his mouth, closed it, then sighed. "I was going to tell you. I just didn't know how." My heart sank. "Tell me what?" His mother spoke before he could. "Daniel's been helping us. We might need to adjust some living arrangements." The words didn't make sense at first. They floated around me, refusing to land. "Adjust how?" I asked slowly. Daniel finally looked at me then, and the guilt in his eyes was unmistakable. "They're thinking about moving," he said. "To where?" I asked. He swallowed. "With us." The room tilted. "With us?" I repeated. "You mean into our house?" He nodded. I felt heat rush to my face, then drain away, leaving me cold. "When were you planning to tell me this?" "Soon," he said quickly. "I swear. I just didn't want to make sure it was really happening." I laughed again, a brittle sound that even I didn't recognize. "And the suitcases?" "They were just seeing if everything fit," Linda said weakly. Fit, as if this was about luggage. I looked around the room, really looked, and noticed things I hadn't before. Papers on the coffee table, printed listings, not grocery lists or bills, but housing ads, notes scribbled in Daniel's handwriting. My handwriting was nowhere to be seen. "You've been planning this," I said quietly, "without me." Daniel stepped forward. "I didn't mean to hurt you." "But you did," I replied. The realization settled over me like a weight. This wasn't a last-minute emergency. This was a decision, a future being arranged while I was busy trying to be supportive, trying to be kind. And as I stood there, surrounded by half-truths and packed bags, I felt something deeper than anger. I felt excluded from my own life. And that was only the beginning of what I was about to learn. I don't remember sitting down, but suddenly I was on the edge of my mother-in-law's couch, my hands folded so tightly in my lap my knuckles ached. The groceries sat forgotten by the door, the carnations already wilting slightly in the warm air. Daniel stood across from me, pacing now, while his parents hovered like they were afraid one wrong word might shatter something fragile. What none of them seemed to understand was that it already had. "I don't understand how you thought this was okay," I said, my voice low, steady in a way that surprised even me. "You've been making plans about our home, our life, and I'm finding out because I brought groceries." Daniel stopped pacing. "It's not like that." "Then what is it like?" I asked. "Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you made a decision that affects both of us without ever asking me." He rubbed his face, frustration flashing across it. "They're my parents. They need help." "And I'm your wife," I said. The words felt heavier than they ever had before. "I thought that meant we made big decisions together." Linda let out a small, shaky sigh. "We didn't want to cause trouble between you two." I turned to her, my chest tight. "Then why didn't you insist he talk to me?" She looked down at her hands. "Daniel said you'd worry, that you already had so much on your plate." I stared at him. "Is that what you told them?" He hesitated just long enough. "I was trying to protect you." That word, protect. It sounded noble until you realized what it really meant. Control, silence, exclusion. "Protect me from what?" I asked. "From having a voice?" His father finally spoke, his tone gruff. "We didn't raise him to be sneaky." "No," I said quietly, "but here we are." The room fell silent again, thick with things unsaid. My mind raced, piecing together moments I had brushed off before. The late nights, the hushed phone calls, the way Daniel had been oddly defensive whenever I mentioned wanting to repaint the guest room or finally turn it into an office.
He knew. He'd known all along. "When were you planning for them to move in?" I asked. Daniel exhaled. "Next month." I felt something inside me crack. "Next month?" I repeated. "So you were just going to tell me one day that my in-laws were moving into our house?" He was going to ease into it. Ease into it? I stood up abruptly, my chair scraping against the floor. You don't ease into something like that. You talk about it. You argue about it. You decide together. Linda stood too, her face pale. "If it's such a problem, we can find another solution." The words stung more than I expected. "That's not what I said," I replied. "This isn't about whether I want to help you. It's about being treated like I matter." Daniel looked at me then, really looked, like he was seeing me for the first time in weeks. "You do matter," he said softly. "Then why don't I feel like it?" I asked. No one had an answer. I grabbed my purse, my movements stiff. "I need to go," I said. "I can't process this here." Daniel stepped toward me. "Let me drive you home." I drove myself. "I'll be fine." As I walked toward the door, Linda reached out and touched my arm. "I'm sorry," she said, her eyes glossy. "I truly am." I nodded, unable to speak, and stepped outside. The cool air hit my face, and only then did I realize I was shaking. My hands trembled as I unlocked my car. I sat there for a long moment before starting the engine, staring at the house I had visited so many times before, a place that suddenly felt unfamiliar. The drive home was a blur. My thoughts spiraled, jumping from anger to sadness to disbelief. This wasn't just about his parents moving in. It was about trust, about partnership, about realizing that the person you thought was on your team had been quietly playing a different game. When I got home, the house felt too quiet. I wandered from room to room, noticing things I hadn't noticed before. The guest room Daniel had insisted we keep open, the empty closet space, the way our life suddenly felt provisional, like I was just a guest in it myself. Daniel came home an hour later. I heard his key in the lock, his footsteps hesitant. He stood in the doorway of the living room, watching me sit on the couch, staring at nothing. "We need to talk," he said. I didn't look at him. "We've been talking, just not together." He sat across from me, leaning forward, elbows on his knees. "I messed up." "Yes," I said simply. "I should have told you from the beginning. I knew you'd say no." That admission hurt more than the lie. "So instead of giving me a chance to surprise you, you decided for me." He swallowed. "I didn't think you'd understand." "I understand more than you think," I replied. "What I don't understand is why you thought going behind my back was better than risking an argument." He was quiet for a long time. When he spoke again, his voice was smaller. "I've always felt responsible for them. Ever since my dad lost his first job years ago, I promised myself I'd never let them struggle again." "I know," I said. "You've told me that." "And now they're struggling," he said. "I panicked." I closed my eyes. "I would have helped, but you didn't even give me the option." He nodded, tears gathering. "I know." We sat there, the weight of his choices pressing down on us. I realized then that this wasn't a single mistake. It was a pattern. Avoid conflict, decide alone, ask for forgiveness instead of permission. And suddenly, so many past arguments made sense. "What happens now?" I asked quietly. He looked up, hope flickering in his eyes. "They can still move in, right? We'll figure it out together?" I laughed softly, though there was no humor in it. "You still don't get it." His brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" "This isn't about whether they move in. It's about whether I can trust you to treat me like a partner." He reached for my hand, but I pulled it back. "I need time," I said, "and I need you to understand that this hurt isn't going to disappear just because you apologized." He nodded, defeated. "I'll do whatever it takes." I wasn't sure if that was true, or if he even knew what "whatever it takes" really meant. That night, I lay awake in our bed, staring at the ceiling while Daniel slept beside me, his breathing uneven. I thought about the woman I had been that morning, cheerfully loading groceries into my car, believing she was supporting her marriage, And I wondered how many times I had done that before, not realizing what was happening behind my back. By morning, one thing was clear. The groceries were never the real issue. They were just the doorway to a truth I could no longer ignore.
Morning came quietly, almost mockingly so. Sunlight spilled through the curtains like nothing in the world had changed, like my marriage hadn't cracked open the day before. Daniel was already awake when I stirred, sitting on the edge of the bed with his elbows on his knees, staring at the floor. He looked tired, older somehow. For a fleeting moment, sympathy tugged at me. Then I remembered the suitcases. "I'm making coffee," I said, my voice flat. "I'll do it," he replied quickly, as if this small act might fix something. "I've got it," I said, and walked past him. In the kitchen, the familiar sounds felt strange. The hum of the fridge, the clink of the mug against the counter. Everything was the same, yet I felt like I was standing in someone else's house. I poured the coffee and leaned against the counter, steadying myself. When Daniel came in, he hovered in the doorway like he didn't know where he was allowed to stand anymore. "I talked to my parents this morning," he said. I didn't turn around. "About what?" "About slowing things down," he replied. "About not making any decisions until you and I figure things out." I finally looked at him. "And how did they take that?" He sighed. "My mom cried. My dad didn't say much." I nodded. "That doesn't surprise me." He frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" "I mean they were already packing," I said. "They thought this was decided." He winced. "I know." I took a sip of my coffee, the bitterness grounding me. "Daniel, I need you to listen without interrupting," I said. "Can you do that?" He nodded immediately. "Yes." "This isn't just about your parents," I continued. "It's about how small I felt standing in that house yesterday, like I was a guest in a plan you'd already written." He opened his mouth, then closed it. "I've supported you every time you've said your parents needed help," I went on. "I've rearranged holidays, weekends, budgets. I've never said they weren't important, but yesterday showed me that when things get hard, you don't lean toward me, you step around me." He swallowed hard. "I didn't realize that's how it came across." "That's because you weren't looking," I said quietly. Silence settled between us again, but it felt different now. He was listening. Whether he truly understood was another question. Later that day, I drove to my sister's house. I hadn't planned to, but I needed air, perspective, someone who knew me before I became Daniel's wife. She took one look at my face and pulled me into a hug without asking questions. We sat at her kitchen table while I told her everything, the groceries, the suitcases, the months of half-truths. She listened, eyes sharp, occasionally shaking her head. "He didn't just forget to tell you," she said when I finished. "He chose not to." I nodded. Hearing it out loud made it sting more, but it also clarified things. "I keep wondering if I'm overreacting." "You're not," she said firmly. "If you were the kind of person who didn't care about his parents, this would be different. But you do care. That's why this hurts." Her words settled into me, soothing something raw. "What would you do?" I asked. She leaned back, considering. "I ask myself if this is the first time he shut you out, or just the first time you caught him." That question followed me all the way home. Over the next few days, Daniel tried. I'll give him that. He cooked dinner, he asked my opinion on things that didn't matter much, like what movie to watch or whether we should rearrange the living room. Each gesture felt careful, almost rehearsed, and underneath it all, there was still the bigger question hovering unspoken. On the fourth day, he asked if we could visit his parents together. "Just to talk," he said, "no decisions." I agreed, though my stomach knotted as we pulled into their driveway again. The suitcases were gone this time, but the tension lingered like a ghost. We sat in the same living room, arranged in an awkward semicircle. Linda clutched a tissue. Robert stared at the floor.
"I want to start by apologizing," he said, "to both of you and to my wife." I appreciated he said wife, not her name, not just a glance in my direction. He continued, "I handled this wrong. I made plans without including her, and that wasn't fair." Linda dabbed her eyes. "We never wanted to come between you two." "I know," I said gently, "but that's what happened." Robert finally looked up. "So what happens now?" he asked. I took a deep breath. "Now we talk honestly," I said. "All of us, no assumptions." They nodded. Over the next hour, truth spilled out about their financial situation, worse than Daniel had admitted, about my fears of losing privacy, of becoming invisible in my own home, about Daniel's lifelong habit of carrying responsibility alone, even when it cost him closeness. At one point, Linda reached for my hand. "I didn't realize you felt so pushed aside," she said. "I'm sorry." I squeezed her hand back. "I don't want to push you away," I replied. "I just don't want to be pushed out." Something shifted then, not magically, not completely, but enough that the air felt lighter. By the time we left, nothing was solved, but for the first time since I'd seen those suitcases, I felt like I was standing on my own feet again. That night, Daniel and I sat on the porch watching the sun dip below the trees. "I don't want to lose you," he said quietly. "I don't want to lose myself," I replied. He nodded, understanding flickering in his eyes. "I think I need to learn how to let you in," he said, "and I need to know you will." It wasn't a promise, but it was a beginning. Still, as I lay in bed later, I knew something else too. Trust, once cracked, doesn't mend overnight, and whether our marriage would survive depended on what Daniel did next, not what he said.
The days that followed were strangely quiet, not peaceful, just careful, like we were both walking through a room filled with glass, afraid that one wrong step would shatter everything beyond repair. Daniel checked in constantly, asking how I felt, if I needed anything, if I wanted to talk. Part of me appreciated the effort. Another part of me resented that it took a near betrayal for him to suddenly notice how much space I took up. I found myself replaying our entire marriage in my head, looking for moments I had dismissed as normal, but now felt different under this new light. The time he agreed to a major repair on the house without telling me until after the deposit was paid. The way he volunteered our spare bedroom to a cousin just for a few weeks that turned into 3 months. Every time he'd said the same thing. "I didn't think you'd mind." And every time I'd swallowed my discomfort, telling myself marriage meant compromise. What I hadn't realized was how often I was the only one compromising. One evening, about a week after the grocery incident, Daniel came home holding a folder. He set it on the table between us like it was something fragile. "I made an appointment with a financial counselor," he said, "for my parents, and for us, together." I studied his face, searching for defensiveness, for that old urgency to fix things without me. I didn't see it, just nerves. "Why?" I asked. "Because I don't want to keep guessing," he replied. "I don't want to keep making decisions out of fear and calling it responsibility." That was new. Daniel had always prided himself on being the responsible one. Hearing him question that identity felt significant. We went to the appointment 2 days later. Sitting in that small office, listening as numbers were laid bare, I felt a strange mix of relief and sadness. Relief that the truth was finally out in the open. Sadness that it had taken so long. Daniel's parents needed help, yes, but not in the way Daniel had assumed. They didn't need to move in immediately. They needed a plan, boundaries, support that didn't erase our marriage in the process. On the drive home, Daniel was quiet. "I thought I was the only safety net they had," he said finally. "You don't have to be, and you don't have to do it alone." That night, something inside me softened, not all the way, but enough that I could breathe again.
Still, trust doesn't rebuild itself just because someone starts doing the right things. A few nights later, I asked him the question that had been sitting heavy on my chest. If I hadn't shown up with those groceries, I said, when were you actually going to tell me? He didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice was honest in a way that hurt. I don't know, he said. I kept telling myself there would be a right moment, but I think I was waiting until it felt inevitable. So I wouldn't feel like I could say no, I said. He nodded. Yes. The admission landed hard, but it was also the first time he hadn't tried to soften the truth for my sake, and oddly enough, that honesty mattered. A week later, Linda invited me out for coffee, just the two of us. I almost declined. I was tired of being the reasonable one, the understanding one. But something told me this conversation mattered. We sat by the window of a quiet cafe, steam rising from our mugs. She twisted her napkin nervously before finally speaking. I need you to know something, she said. Daniel has always been like this. I looked at her. Like what? Carrying things by himself, deciding what's best without asking. He learned it young. His father worked all the time, and I leaned on Daniel more than I should have. Her honesty surprised me. I don't blame you, I said. I do, she replied softly, a little, and I don't want to be the reason your marriage suffers. I felt my throat tighten. I don't want that either. She reached across the table and squeezed my hand. If we ever move in with you, she said, it will only be because you want us there truly. I believed her, and that mattered more than she knew. When I got home, I told Daniel about the conversation. He listened quietly, his eyes shiny. I didn't realize how much pressure you put on me, he said. You didn't realize because you didn't ask, I replied gently. That night, for the first time in a long while, we talked without trying to fix anything. We talked about fears, about expectations we'd never voiced, about how love can quietly turn into obligation if you're not careful. I told him how invisible I'd felt. He told me how terrified he was of failing the people he loved. Somewhere in the middle of that conversation, I realized something important. Daniel wasn't a villain, but he wasn't blameless either, and neither was I. I had taught him in small ways that I would adapt, that I would bend, that I would stay quiet to keep the peace. A month passed. His parents stayed in their home with a clearer plan and more support than before. Daniel included me in every conversation, sometimes awkwardly, sometimes overcorrecting, but always trying. And I watched him closely, not with suspicion, but with awareness. One evening, as we cooked dinner together, he paused and looked at me. I almost agreed to something today without talking to you, he admitted. I smiled faintly. And I realized how automatic it was, he said, how easy. That's how patterns work, I replied. He nodded. I'm trying to break it. I believed him, but belief, I had learned, is not blind. It's earned, again and again. As I went to bed that night, I thought about the woman who had walked into her in-laws' house with grocery bags and walked out with her world tilted sideways. She didn't know what she was walking into, but she knew, deep down, that something wasn't right. Sometimes the smallest acts of kindness are what lead us to the biggest truths, and sometimes freezing in place is the first step towards finally moving forward.
Time has a way of smoothing the sharpest edges, but it also has a way of revealing what's real beneath the surface. As weeks turned into months, life settled into something that looked normal again. On the outside, everything appeared fine. Daniel went to work, I went to work, dinners were cooked, laundry folded, bills paid. But underneath that routine, something fundamental had shifted. I was no longer moving through my marriage on autopilot. I was paying attention. Daniel's parents visited every Sunday for lunch. At first, I braced myself each time, waiting for that old tightness in my chest. But slowly, those visits became easier. Linda asked before bringing anything over. Robert offered to help with repairs instead of assuming. Small gestures, but meaningful ones.
Still, I noticed how Daniel hovered, ready to jump in at the slightest sign of discomfort, like he was afraid one wrong move would send everything crashing down again. One afternoon, after his parents left, I finally said it. "You don't have to manage everyone's feelings," I told him. He looked at me confused. "I thought that's what I was supposed to do." "That's what you've always done," I replied, "but it's not sustainable, and it's not fair to you." He sat down heavily on the couch, rubbing his hands together. "If I don't, things fall apart." "Or," I said gently, "they rearrange themselves." That idea seemed to sit with him. Around that time, something unexpected happened. My own mother got sick, not critically, but enough that she needed help for a few weeks. Without thinking, Daniel offered to stay with her overnight when I couldn't. He coordinated with my siblings, drove her to appointments, stocked her fridge. He asked me before every decision, even the small ones. One evening, as we drove home from my mother's house, I realized I wasn't bracing myself anymore. I wasn't waiting for the other shoe to drop. I was watching him show up in a way I hadn't seen before. "I notice what you're doing," I said quietly. He glanced at me. "What do you mean?" "With my mom," I replied. "You're being supportive without taking over. You're asking instead of assuming." He nodded. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said, about partnership." My heart softened in a way I hadn't expected. Healing, I was learning, doesn't always arrive with fireworks. Sometimes it slips in quietly through consistency. Still, the past has a way of resurfacing when you least expect it. One night, months later, I found an email open on Daniel's laptop by accident. It was from a realtor. My stomach dropped instantly, that old familiar fear rushing back. I confronted him immediately, my voice trembling despite myself. "Why is there an email from a realtor?" He didn't get defensive. He didn't dodge. He took a breath. "I wanted to talk to you about that," he said. "When?" I asked. "Tonight," he replied. "I was looking at options for my parents, downsizing, something closer to us." The tension in my chest eased just a fraction. "And?" He said, "And I didn't respond because I wanted to talk to you first." That moment mattered more than he knew, not because of the realtor, but because of the pause, the choice to stop. We sat down together and talked through it, really talked. We discussed finances, boundaries, timelines. We disagreed. We compromised. And when we were done, I felt tired but intact, included. Later that night, I realized how far we'd come. Trust wasn't back to where it once was, but it was being rebuilt on something stronger than before. Honesty, intention, awareness. A year passed from the day I brought those groceries to my in-laws' house. On that anniversary, Daniel surprised me by taking the day off work. We drove out to a quiet park, sat on a bench overlooking the water. "I've been thinking about that day," he said. "So have I replied. "You almost lost me," he said softly. "You almost lost me," I agreed. "But more importantly, I almost lost myself." He nodded, tears in his eyes. "Thank you for not letting that happen." I looked at him then, really looked. He wasn't perfect, he never would be, but neither was I. What mattered was that we had learned something vital. Love doesn't mean sacrificing your voice. Support doesn't mean silence. And family, no matter how close, doesn't get to erase partnership. As we sat there, I thought back to the shock of seeing those suitcases, to the way my body had frozen before my mind caught up. At the time, it felt like betrayal. And in many ways it was. But it was also a wake-up call, one that forced us to confront patterns we'd both been ignoring. Sometimes life brings you groceries and expects you to carry them quietly. And sometimes those groceries lead you straight into the truth. I don't know what the future holds. I know challenges will come, but I also know this. I will never again confuse peace with silence, and I will never again support something that requires me to disappear. That's the lesson I carried home that day, not in grocery bags, but in my heart. Life has a strange way of testing lessons just when you think you've learned them. Not loudly, not dramatically, but quietly, in moments that look ordinary on the surface. It was about 3 months after that anniversary at the park when Daniel came home one evening and said, "My dad called today." His tone was neutral, but something in his posture told me this wasn't casual conversation. I set down the dish towel and looked at him. "Okay." "He lost his job," Daniel said. The words landed gently, but they carried weight. I didn't panic. I didn't freeze. Instead, I took a slow breath. "What does that mean for them?" Daniel exhaled. "That's what I wanted to talk to you about before I say anything else." That sentence alone told me how much had changed. We sat at the kitchen table, the same place where so many unspoken things had once piled up between us. "They're not in immediate danger," he said. "They have some savings, but it's going to be tight, and my mom's health expenses aren't getting cheaper." I nodded. "Are they asking to move in?" "No," he said quickly. "Not yet, and I told them we wouldn't even discuss that without you." I studied his face. There was concern there, real and deep, but no urgency to act without thinking. "What do you want to do?" I asked. He hesitated. "I want to help, but I don't want to repeat the past." "Then let's not," I said simply. That night we made lists, practical ones, options, short-term help, long-term plans, boundaries. We talked about what we could give without resentment and where our limits were. It wasn't romantic, it wasn't easy, but it felt honest. A few days later, Daniel suggested we invite his parents over, not to deliver news, but to listen. That distinction mattered. When Linda and Robert arrived, there was tension, but also something new, respect. They waited for us to speak. "We want to support you," I said, surprising even myself with how steady my voice sounded. "But we need to do it in a way that works for everyone." Linda nodded slowly. "We understand," she said. "We don't want to be a burden." "You're not," Daniel said, "but we're a team, all of us." Over the next few weeks, we helped where we could. Groceries again, yes, but this time with full transparency. Budgeted, discussed, shared. No secrets, no suitcases. One evening, as I carried bags into their house, I paused at the doorway. For a moment, memory rushed back. The shock, the silence, the feeling of being blindsided. But this time, Daniel was beside me, holding the door open, asking, "Are you okay?" I nodded. "I am." And I truly was. What surprised me most during that period wasn't Daniel's growth. It was my own. I spoke up faster. I trusted my discomfort. When something felt off, I named it. And each time I did, the world didn't end. No one collapsed. No one accused me of being selfish. In fact, things worked better. One night, my sister came over for dinner. After Daniel stepped outside to take a call, she leaned toward me and smiled. "You're different," she said. "How so?" I asked. "You take up space now," she replied, "and you're not apologizing for it." Her words stayed with me. Months later, Daniel's father found part-time work, not perfect, but enough to ease the pressure. His parents regained their footing slowly, with dignity intact. And our marriage, our real marriage, not the quiet, one-sided version I had lived in before, felt sturdier than it ever had. One evening, as we folded laundry together, Daniel said something that caught me off guard. "He used to think being a good husband meant solving problems," he said. "Now I think it means standing next to you while we solve them." I smiled. "That's a good definition." He paused, then added, "I'm sorry it took me almost losing you to learn that." I looked at him, really looked, and felt something settle into place. "I'm glad you learned," I said. "Some people never do." Later that night, lying in bed, I reflected on how close I'd come to disappearing into someone else's expectations, how easy it would have been to keep saying yes, to keep being supportive at the cost of myself. That grocery trip seemed so small at the time, just another errand, another act of love. but it cracked open a truth that changed everything. Sometimes support isn't about what you carry for others, it's about what you refuse to carry alone. And sometimes the bravest thing you can do is stop in the doorway, feel the fear, and walk forward anyway. This time with your eyes open. By the time another year rolled around, the memory of that first grocery trip no longer felt sharp, but it was never far away. It lived quietly in the background, like a scar you forget about until you run your fingers over it and remember exactly how deep the wound once was. I didn't resent that memory anymore. In a strange way, I respected it. It reminded me who I had been and who I refused to be again. Daniel and I fell into a rhythm that felt more intentional than comfortable. We checked in with each other about decisions that affected us both, even the ones that seemed small. At first, it felt almost awkward, like we were learning a new language, but over time it became natural, necessary. We were no longer assuming, we were asking. One evening, Daniel came home later than usual. I noticed the tension in his shoulders immediately. He tried to hide it, but after everything we'd been through, I'd learned to read the subtle signs. "Rough day?" I asked. He nodded. "Can we talk after dinner?" My stomach tightened, but I didn't panic. That alone told me how much I'd changed. "Of course," I said. After we ate, he took a deep breath. "My mom asked something today," he said carefully. I waited. "She asked if, down the line, if things got bad again, we'd consider them moving in." There it was, the question I'd known would come eventually. Daniel watched my face closely, searching for fear, anger, resistance. I felt all of those things flicker inside me, but they didn't control me. "And what did you say?" I asked. "I told her I'd talk to you first, that we'd decide together." That was the right answer. Still, my chest felt tight. How did she react? "She said she understood," he said. "She didn't push. She just wanted to know where we stood." I nodded slowly. "Okay," I said. "Then let's talk about where we stand." We sat down on the couch, the space between us filled not with tension, but with honesty. I'm not saying never, but I am saying not without clear boundaries, not without a timeline, and not with us being on the same page emotionally, not just practically. He listened, really listened. "That makes sense," he said, "and I agree." I studied his face, searching for that old defensiveness, that subtle urgency. It wasn't there. "You do?" I asked. "Yes," he said, "because I don't want to build a life where you feel like you're bracing all the time." Something inside me softened again, not relief exactly, trust slowly earned. A few weeks later, we attended a family gathering for his extended relatives. It was loud, chaotic, full of overlapping conversations and shared history I was only partially a part of. At one point, an aunt I barely knew pulled me aside. "You're such a saint, putting up with everything Daniel's parents have been through." The old version of me would have smiled politely and let that label stick. Saint, quiet, accommodating. Instead, I met her eyes. "I'm not a saint," I said calmly. "I'm a partner." She looked startled, then nodded awkwardly. "Of course," she murmured. Daniel found me a few minutes later and slipped his hand into mine. "Everything okay?" he asked. "Yes," I said, and for once I meant it without qualification. That night, as we drove home, he said, "I heard what you said to my aunt." I glanced at him. "Was that okay?" He smiled. "It was more than okay. It was true." That moment mattered, not because of what was said, but because of who stood beside me when it was. Not everything was perfect. We still argued, we still misunderstood each other. There were moments when Daniel slipped into old habits, moments when I had to remind him or myself why we were doing things differently now. But the difference was that those moments didn't spiral. They became conversations instead of conflicts avoided. One night, I dreamt about that day again, the grocery bags, the silence, the suitcases. But this time in the dream, I didn't freeze. I set the bags down and spoke. When I woke up, my heart was racing, but I smiled. Even my subconscious knew I wasn't that woman anymore. Months later, Linda surprised me by asking for my help with something personal. She wanted advice about a decision she'd been putting off, unsure how Daniel would react. As she spoke, I realized something quietly profound. She wasn't just respecting boundaries now, she was learning from them. "I trust your judgment," she said at the end of our conversation. I thought about that for a long moment. "Thank you," I replied. "That means a lot." After she left, Daniel wrapped his arms around me. "You know," he said, "I think you changed more than just our marriage." I leaned into him. "I didn't set out to," I said. "I just stopped disappearing." That was the heart of it. I hadn't become louder or harder or less kind. I had simply remained present with myself, with my needs, with the truth. Looking back now, I see how easy it would have been to mistake that grocery trip for a kindness that went unappreciated. But it was more than that. It was the moment I learned that support without respect is not love, it's erasure. And love, real love, should never require you to vanish in order to survive.
There are moments in life when you don't realize you've crossed into a new chapter until you look back and notice how different your reactions have become. For me, that realization came on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon when my phone buzzed with a message from Daniel while I was at work. "Can we talk tonight?" it read. No context, no explanation. Once upon a time, that message would have sent my thoughts spiraling. I would have replayed every interaction, braced myself for bad news, prepared to shrink or soothe or compromise before the conversation even began. But this time, I simply replied, "Yes, what's going on?" He answered honestly, "Nothing bad, just something important." That distinction mattered. When I got home, he was already there, sitting at the kitchen table with 2 cups of tea. I noticed the effort immediately. "What's up?" I asked, sitting across from him. "I've been offered a promotion," he said. My eyebrows lifted. "That's great." "It is," he agreed, "but it comes with a transfer. Different city, same company." The words settled between us, not with fear, but with weight. This was big, life-shaping, the kind of decision that once might have been made quietly with plans drawn up before I even knew there was a choice to make. "And?" I prompted gently. "And I haven't said yes," he said, "because I want to talk about it with you, really talk about it." I felt something warm bloom in my chest. "Okay," I said, "tell me everything." We spent hours that night talking through the possibilities, what the move would mean for my job, for our support systems, for his parents, what we wanted long term, what we were afraid of. There were moments of excitement, moments of hesitation, moments when we realized we wanted different things and then found middle ground. At one point, he stopped and said, "Thank you for not assuming the worst." I smiled softly. "Thank you for not giving me a reason to." That conversation didn't end with a decision. It ended with mutual understanding, and that, I had learned, was just as valuable. Over the next few weeks, the promotion became a family topic. Daniel talked to his parents openly about the possibility of moving farther away. Linda surprised both of us by saying, "You can't plan your life around us. We'll figure things out." I caught Daniel looking at her like he was seeing her for the first time. Meanwhile, I noticed changes in myself, too. I stopped preemptively offering solutions to other people's problems. I stopped filling silences with reassurance. I let discomfort exist without rushing to smooth it over. And the world didn't fall apart. In fact, relationships became clearer, healthier.
One evening, my sister called me frustrated about her own marriage. As I listened, I heard echoes of my old self in her words. "I just keep doing what needs to be done," she said. "I don't want to rock the boat." Something in me stirred. "But are you allowed in the boat?" I asked gently. She was quiet for a long moment. "I don't know," she admitted. After we hung up, I sat with that thought. How many of us mistake endurance for love? How often do we celebrate the people who carry everything quietly without asking why they have to? The decision about Daniel's promotion came a month later. We said no, not because it wasn't a good opportunity, but because the timing wasn't right for both of us. And when Daniel told his boss, he didn't feel resentment or regret. He felt grounded. A few weeks after that, his parents came over for dinner. Halfway through the meal, Robert raised his glass. "I want to say something," he said. We all looked at him, surprised. "I know I haven't always handled things well," he continued, "but I want you both to know how grateful I am, not just for the help, for the honesty." Linda nodded, tears in her eyes. "We see the difference," she said, "and we don't want to go back." I felt my throat tighten. Neither do we. Later that night, as Daniel and I cleaned up, he leaned against the counter and said, "I'm proud of us." I smiled. Me too. But pride wasn't the end of the story. Awareness was. The understanding that growth isn't a destination you arrive at and rest. It's a practice, one you choose again and again, especially when old habits whisper that it would be easier to go back to how things were. Sometimes I still think about those groceries, the weight of the bags in my hands, the moment my body knew the truth before my mind could catch up. I used to wish I could go back and warn that version of myself. Now I realize she didn't need a warning, she needed the courage she already had. Because in the end, I didn't just bring groceries that day. I brought my whole self into a room where I had been missing. And once I did, there was no going back. There's a quiet confidence that comes from knowing you can handle hard truths, not because they don't hurt, but because you trust yourself to survive them. That confidence had slowly taken root in me, though I didn't fully recognize it until another test came along, one that had nothing to do with Daniel's parents and everything to do with me. I was offered a position at my company that I'd quietly wanted for years. It was a leadership role, more responsibility, more visibility, the kind of opportunity I used to downplay before anyone could question whether I deserved it. When my manager told me, my first instinct was to think of all the reasons it might be inconvenient for others: longer hours, travel, less flexibility. That night, I told Daniel about the offer, watching his face carefully. Old habits die hard. "What do you think?" I asked. He smiled. "I think you should take it if you want it." Just like that. No caveats, no mention of how it might affect him. I felt tears sting my eyes. "You don't even want to talk about how it would change things?" "We can talk about logistics," he said, "but whether you deserve it isn't a question." Something inside me shifted, not dramatically, just enough to settle more firmly into place. I took the job. The first few months were intense. I was stretched in ways I hadn't been before, learning to lead without shrinking, to speak without apologizing. At home, Daniel adjusted without complaint. He cooked more. He picked up errands. When I thanked him, he shook his head. "This is what support looks like," he said. That sentence stayed with me. Around that time, Linda invited me to lunch, not to talk about logistics or family needs, but to celebrate my new role. She brought a small gift, a notebook with my initials embossed on the cover. "For your big ideas," she said, smiling. I hugged her, surprised by the emotion rising in my chest. "Thank you." As we ate, she said something I hadn't expected. "I've been thinking a lot about that day you came over with the groceries." So had I. I didn't realize then how much you were carrying, she continued. I'm glad you didn't stay quiet. Her words felt like a benediction, a closing of a loop I hadn't known was still open. Not everything was smooth. There were days I came home exhausted, doubting myself. Days Daniel struggled too, old instincts tugging at him when things felt uncertain. But we caught ourselves. We talked. We adjusted. That was the difference. One evening, after a particularly long day, I sat alone in the living room, lights off, just breathing. Daniel joined me, sitting quietly until I spoke. Do you ever think about how close we came to losing all of this? I asked. He nodded. Every day. Does that scare you? I asked. Yes, he said, but it keeps me honest. I smiled. Me too. We had learned that fear isn't always something to avoid. Sometimes it's a signal, a reminder of what matters. As the years moved forward, that lesson showed up in unexpected ways. In friendships where I spoke up sooner, in family dynamics where I set boundaries without guilt, in the way I taught my niece by example that being kind doesn't mean being silent. One afternoon, I found myself back at my in-laws' house alone. Linda had asked me to help her organize old photos. As we sat on the floor, sorting through albums, she pulled out a picture of Daniel as a teenager, standing stiffly beside his parents. He was always trying to be the adult, she said softly. I looked at the photo, seeing it clearly now. I don't think he has to be anymore, I said. She nodded. Neither do you. That moment felt full circle. Driving home, I realized how far we'd all come from that frozen moment in the doorway, how one act of unintended discovery had reshaped not just my marriage, but the way our entire family functioned, not perfectly, but honestly. That night, I wrote in the notebook Linda had given me, not goals or plans, just truths about who I was becoming, about what I would no longer accept, about the quiet power of saying, I matter too. I closed the notebook feeling lighter, because the story I once thought was about groceries and betrayal had turned into something else entirely. It was about visibility, voice, and the courage to step fully into your own life, even when it means disappointing people you love, especially then.
Some endings don't arrive with a dramatic slam. They come quietly, like the soft click of a door finally closing behind you. By the time I realized this chapter of my life was ending, it had already been replaced by something steadier, something truer. Not perfect, just real. Years had passed since that day I brought groceries to my in-laws' house, unaware that I was walking straight into a truth I couldn't unsee. If I close my eyes, I can still remember the weight of those bags, the way my arms ached, the way my body froze before my mind understood why. For a long time, I thought that moment was about betrayal, about my husband choosing his parents over me, about secrets and suitcases and silence. But time has a way of refining the truth. That moment wasn't just about what Daniel did wrong. It was about what I had been allowing, the ways I had mistaken endurance for love, the ways I had quietly shrunk myself to make room for everyone else. I didn't see it then, but that freeze in the doorway wasn't weakness. It was instinct, my inner voice finally speaking up after years of being politely ignored. Life now looks different, not because everything is easy, but because everything is honest. Daniel and I still face challenges, his parents still age, needs still arise, decisions still carry weight, but we meet those moments side by side, not with one of us pulling ahead and the other scrambling to catch up. One evening, long after the crisis had faded into memory, Daniel and I sat at the kitchen table again, the same table where secrets had once lived. Papers were spread out in front of us, plans for the next year. He slid a document toward me. I want your thoughts before I respond, he said. I smiled to myself, not because of the document, because of the habit.
Later that night, as I washed dishes, I realized something else had changed. I no longer needed constant reassurance that I mattered. I knew it deeply, solidly. And that knowledge didn't come from Daniel alone. It came from the choices I had made since that day, the boundaries I had drawn, the words I had finally spoken. Linda and Robert never moved in with us. They found their own rhythm, their own solutions. We remained close, but no longer entangled. Linda once told me, "I think we all needed that wake-up call." I believe she was right. As for me, I grew into myself in ways I hadn't expected. I stopped volunteering to carry everything. I stopped preemptively fixing problems that weren't mine to solve. I learned that being supportive doesn't mean being silent, and that love isn't proven by how much you can endure. Sometimes I imagine speaking to the woman I was back then, the one loading groceries with a hopeful heart, believing that being a good wife meant never making things uncomfortable. I wouldn't warn her. I wouldn't tell her to turn around. I'd simply say this: trust what you feel. You're not wrong for wanting to be included. You're not difficult for wanting a voice. And you're not selfish for refusing to disappear. If you're listening to this and something in your chest feels tight, I want you to know something too. Support should never require your erasure. Love should never ask you to shrink. And family, no matter how complicated, should never be built on silence. That day, I brought groceries to help my husband. What I didn't know was that I was also bringing myself to a moment of reckoning, one that would change how I loved, how I spoke, and how I stood in my own life. I didn't walk away from my marriage. I walked into it fully for the first time, and I never left myself behind again. That is the ending. Not perfect, but whole.